Hi, my name is Cassandra. I am a health psychologist in training. Currently, I'm doing my doctorate. I'm also a acceptance and commitment therapy practitioner and mindful self-compassion practitioner. Um, my little video that I'm doing today is going to be all around rejection sensitivity. This might be something that not everybody is familiar with, so I just wanted to do a little video about it and to just explore a little bit. So, what is rejection sensitivity? Well, any of us can feel a bit sad or demoralised or a bit embarrassed or even awkward in many of the difficult situations that we have. They might bring up difficult emotions when we're rejected or perceived to have been rejected. Maybe somebody didn't want that second date with us, prefer to be friends, or maybe the job interview we just went to, we thought it went well, but then they called us and said that somebody else was more qualified or more experienced, that sort of thing. Well, experiences like this, these kinds of everyday rejections that we have in life, well, they can be a bit difficult at the time, can't they? But for most people, we're able to process that experience when it happens to us and move forward without it causing any lingering problems for us and affecting our day-to-day lives. For people who can self-regulate, people who can self-regulate those emotions, and they have a stable sense of who they are and a stable sense of self-worth. These little bumps in the road are just that. They're just bumps in the road. And sometimes we can even say, well, you know what, there was a silver lining to that cloud. Maybe I got an even better job. Or maybe I gained a really good friend from that date that didn't work out so well. For some other people, though, the idea of rejection, any kind of rejection, either real or perceived, there's a distinction here between real and perceived. Any rejection is unacceptable and crushing. And for those people, they experience a real sensitivity around rejection, which can cause massive fallout for them in their relationships and even in their sense of self and their sense of self-worth and their identity. So let's have a look at perceived rejection here, because for these people, this is about perception, a perception of rejection, which is an important distinction. So when we talk about the perception of rejection, what I mean by this is for those with rejection sensitivity, the volume on what counts as rejection is turned up to the max. And they're going to see rejection everywhere, where a typical person is not going to do that. And it can be particularly problematic in certain contexts. For example, they might be extremely sensitive to rejection in romantic relationships, or sensitive rejection from men or women. Not all people who are sensitive to rejection are aware of it. And it can be quite unusual for them to be aware of it. Because what we're talking about here is an adaptive and defensive behaviour, which develop quite early in life quite often. And we'll explore a little bit of the psychology behind that as we go. So, who's at risk here? Who's more likely to be rejection sensitive? Well, anyone who's suffered abuse in childhood or adulthood, which has left them prone to complex trauma, something I talk about a lot. I have a real interest in that. People who've had difficult or erratic or disorganised relationships with their primary caregivers as a child. So unhealthy relationships with parents, that might include being abandoned by more than one of them or one of them. Or emotionally unavailable parents. A good example of that might be the parent. The parent expected the child to look after them. The roles are kind of reversed. And the child's meeting the parents' needs, whether those are physical, emotional, rather than the other way around. Or it could be a controlling, a bullying or interfering, smothering parent. And all of that can result in what we call in psychology a disorganised pattern of early childhood attachment. So we're gonna explore that later on. So there as well a few clinical conditions that make people a lot more likely to experience rejection sensitivity, and those are ADHD. And in that condition, it can be related to impulse control. And a big one here is cluster B personality disorders, most notably borderline personality disorder. And I talk a lot about cluster B personality disorders in the work that I do around trauma. And the reason that people with borderline personality disorder may experience rejection sensitivity is around their fear of abandonment, which is all-consuming quite often. And it can tie into that, and as well as that lack of self-regulation, lack of emotional regulation, that libidity, mood swings, and black and white thinking, all that stuff that happens with borderline. And of course, complex trauma. Fields, that I do talk a lot about, a condition I talk a lot about. So those conditions, it may be more likely that the person may experience some rejection sensitivity. So we're going to talk signs and symptoms, and we're going to do that by looking at moods, thoughts, and behaviour. And when we look at rejection sensitivity as psychologists, we see that there's two components involved in it internally for that person, and one going on externally. The first are the feelings of that person. They're going to be fear-driven and anxious in nature, anxiety around rejection. And then there's a cognitive component where they're going to appraise a given situation in a certain context and see that as threatening, because rejection is likely to happen in it. They're going to perceive that rejection will happen. So cognitively, their thoughts are going to be going that way. So those thoughts and feelings working together, they're kind of creating the perfect storm here that is going to trigger off certain behaviours happening with that person. And that's the external element with what's going on here. So we'll take a look at it now. Now, the unique previous life experiences of this person with rejection sensitivity are going to come into play here. They're going to affect that behaviour. So what happens is that they develop triggers around certain situations and contexts that cause those alarm bells, that little rejection alarm to begin ringing. And it causes them to behave in ways that other more typical people might find extreme or disproportionate or even baffling or perhaps even frightening. So people involved might include friends, romantic partners, so it might be the triggers. People in authority might trigger them, or just even complete strangers. Contexts could include disagreements, arguments, any sort of conflict, financial issues maybe, perceived criticism, or if the person has to ask for help, they might fear that they might be rejected. Sex and intimacy can also be a trigger. And triggering might crop up at certain times of year, like Christmas, holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, things like that. And those triggers are going to be unique to that individual. So now we know the triggers and contexts are linked to behaviour. What might that behaviour look like? Well, I'm going to give a little example of what rejection sensitivity might look like. So we imagine that we're the rejection sensitive person, and we send a text to our friend, but our friend has not answered that message immediately. So for us, that person with rejection sensitivity, that has triggered us now. So we become extremely fearful and anxious around that. And of course, cognitively, we're thinking, she's ignoring me. She doesn't care about me. How dare she? And we can see how those cognitive thoughts are beginning to go as we perceive that this is a rejection, the fact that she hasn't replied immediately. So what do we do next? Well, it might cause this person to lash out. I'm going to call up this friend. I'm going to have words with her. So the rejection sensitive person phones up her friend and has a good old rant. Good old rant. At this perceived slight. And of course the poor friend, this is going to cause that poor friend, the typically minded friend, to be hurt. Especially since the reason she didn't reply was probably, maybe she was driving. So the rejection sensitive person does not hear any reasonable or logical explanation, even if there is one. This isn't how their mind is working at that point while they're lashing out. They're not using their higher order reasoning here, their logic or anything. It's just pure lashing out. You're using your more base reptilian reactions here. And so that person, the rejection sensitive person, is saying the most vile and hurtful things. So what happens then? As the friend's going to back away or retreat from that person. Which is a natural response to being verbally attacked. So for the rejection sensitive person, what we have going on here is a self-fulfilling prophecy. For the friend, this might not be the first time the rejection sensitive person has done this, or that this has happened in their relationship, and that they behave this way. So the friend may be reluctant to discuss the behaviour with the rejection sensitive person, because it's likely that, they're thinking, well, maybe this will just trigger it off again. Might lead to another outburst, or maybe even threats. So eventually, what's going to happen here is that the friend will not be able to take this behaviour anymore, and gradually they're going to completely withdraw from this person in their life. And for the rejection sensitive person, this kind of confirms that their thinking around this all along was completely correct, and they have been rejected. So yeah, here we have the self-fulfilling prophecy of what's going on. The cycle that's going to keep continuing. And it can leave the rejection sensitive person very lonely and consigned to having these really short, unstable relationships with people. And that's going to compound the problem, because it's a cycle. It's very sad for the rejection sensitive person, and it could be frightening for the friend too, in this situation, this example I've given you. That hostility going on. So in relationships between men and women, sometimes there are differences. There have been differences observed in research, especially around jealousy, with men being more likely to have this excessive jealousy around rejection sensitivity. And there's some evidence that it can be linked to controlling and abusive behaviour of that kind. Now, just because somebody is scared or anxious and lashing out because of fear, it doesn't give them the right to be abusive to other people. Of course it doesn't. We can be compassionate for people for the reasons why they might be doing this, lashing out like a scared animal. But that does not mean that we have to accept that behaviour. Obviously, rejection sensitivity can be absolutely disastrous for personal relationships, and we're going to talk about the research that bears that out. So Downey and Feldman, I think it's 1998, have done a fair bit of research around this topic and found that rejection sensitive people, they perceive rejection even in the completely neutral behaviour of others. And with more typical people who aren't rejection sensitive, not seeing the threat or the rejection in the same situation. In relationships, the rejection sensitive person has been shown to see behaviour as insensitive, and couples where one or both people were rejection sensitive were more likely to experience conflict and expressions of dissatisfaction in the relationship than their more typical peers who don't have rejection sensitivity. So amongst this cohort, dissatisfaction was often said to be around complaints about either jealousy or hostile language or behaviour from the rejection sensitive partner towards their non-rejection sensitive partners, that lashing out. But in all cases, the rejection and the fearful behaviour around that, the rejection sensitivity and the fearful behaviour around that, made it more likely that the rejection sensitive person would ultimately be rejected because of their hostile and defensive behaviour and not kind of all that unpleasant behaviour. So let's try and understand this a little bit, shall we? Let's try to understand why and how people become sensitive to rejection. And to do that, we can look back at some real classical development psychology here. And that is, what do we mean by developmental psychology? Well, we mean that is how we learn and grow from being babies to being adults. That's what development psychology is about. So psychologists like Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, they stress the importance of early childhood attachment of infants to their primary caregiver. And they observed that when that bonding process is interrupted for whatever reason, it can lead a child to become insecurely attached. And what does that mean? Well, that means that they learn that their needs are not going to be met by their caregiver. And they won't have that safe little rock that they can stand on. And then they can explore the world from that little rock safely. They've got that little retreat to go back to. And they learn that the world isn't safe and that people won't meet their needs. So why does this happen? Well, it can happen because of abuse, of course it can, and neglect. And it can be related to trauma and adverse childhood experiences. We call those ACEs. And these are the things that can disrupt or disorganize that natural attachment process that goes on for children. So that can be things that the caregiver has no control over before we go blaming mum or dad or whoever the caregiver is, before we start apportioning blame to mum. That can be things that the caregiver has no control over, like divorce, abuse or herself or himself being abused. It could be separation. It could be incarceration. It can be physical or mental ill health. Any of those things can disrupt that process. So, what happens to this child when they discover that the world isn't a safe place and people can't be trusted? Well, they develop a defensive, adaptive strategy to cope with those fear and any shame that they've got too around that inability rather, that they've got to protect themselves and keep themselves safe or free of harm or distress. So rejection sensitivity can be a defensive strategy that is adaptive in origin, that people can carry forward from those early experiences, sometimes from infancy to adulthood. So we are talking about a long-term and deeply ingrained defensive adaptation going on here. And it's kind of like hypervigilance around the idea of being rejected. A really good question here to put in here is it linked to social anxiety? Well, the answer to that is yes and no. Anxiety is the common thread here, but the reasons for that anxiety may be very different. With social anxiety, this can be more generalised and situational, stresses in the environment, that kind of thing. We're a bit nervous about the PowerPoint presentation or things like that. Yes, that's social anxiety, but what we're talking about is something more deeply ingrained here. And it's a deep-seated sense of insecurity at some point early in the life of this person. They've learned that people are not safe and they're going to be rejected by them. So what's the impact on people's lives here? Well, rejection sensitivity, it can be absolutely devastating. Rejection sensitive behaviours can range from being unpleasant and a bit hurtful to being abusive, destructive, or even sometimes dangerous. So for those around the afflicted person, they're going to have a real struggle. They're going to feel like they're walking on eggshells, and possibly whatever they say is wrong. They might feel like their wishes or their needs come secondary to the rejection sensitive persons. And they might be constantly waiting and on edge for the next outburst to come. It could cause the partner or the friend or the colleague of that person, whatever the relationship is, to become anxious or even possibly traumatise themselves. For those people to who this applies, it is so important that you work on your boundaries and let that rejection sensitive person know that although you care for them and that their behaviour is hurtful to you and is hurting you, and that you won't tolerate that behaviour. Let's make a definite differentiation between the behaviour and the person. So it's your behaviour that I won't tolerate. And be very clear about that, because the rejection sensitive person, if you criticise them, you're criticising them as a person rather than the behaviour. So be distinct. It's about the behaviour. But we don't tolerate it. Make no excuses or apologies for retreating from this harmful behaviour, unacceptable behaviour, or abusive behaviour. That it's harmful to your mind and your body and your soul, your heart. You have every right to protect yourself from that. So for the rejection sensitive person, of course, all of this will result in their relationships following a very definite pattern. And that pattern might even be lifelong, being turbulent, often very short-lived, because people do not like to be subject to these kinds of outbursts. And that can be very terribly sad for them. Even though they seek, and very often they desperately do want human connection. The fear and those defensive outlashing, they really do sabotage them, no matter how understanding their friends or family or their partner might be. So the first step here is being aware of the rejection sensitivity for that person. And once they're aware that that's something that affects them, they're able to look at triggers and understand what the triggers and the contexts are. And that can help them to be able to begin to break that cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy around that rejection sensitivity and begin to change the behaviours. And so that's an important step. Another important step is taking responsibility for the harm and hurt or the destruction they visited upon other people. That's an important step, because by taking responsibility, you're also empowering yourself there. I'm responsible for this, and that means that I can change this. So that can be very important too, in breaking that cycle they're stuck in. So what can we do about this problem? Well, you know what? Rejection sensitivity can be part of an overall clinical diagnosis of other conditions, and very often clinicians working with these specific conditions, like borderline personality disorder or complex trauma, will be able to recommend appropriate treatments and interventions, and that might include various medications. It might involve talking therapies, which seek to tackle those two factors we talked about, the thoughts and the feelings, in order to impact on the behaviour. So that might include things like CBT and DBT, which are really effective therapies that involve working with thought patterns and feelings which affect behaviour. In intimate partner relationships, a relationship therapist will be able to work with a couple around this issue. Although my advice to anyone who is in a relationship where they're experiencing distressing, abusive or controlling behaviour, or excessive jealousy, threats of any kind, including threats of abandonment, or if your partner's threatening to self-harm, or any verbal, emotional or physical stuff that makes you feel terrible inside, any of that stuff. If that is the case for you, then my advice to you right now is to remove yourself from that harm for the time being and put your self-protection first. And it can be difficult to do because as compassionate people, often we want to help the rejection sensitive person, don't we? But by tolerating and excusing their behaviour or turning a blind eye to it, you also in some sense deprive them of any opportunity to take responsibility for their actions because there's no consequences there. So to be able to have those boundaries is also helpful to your partner or the person that the relationship involves. It is definitely worth working on those boundaries and not tolerating this. So, yeah, help them to take responsibility for those actions. It isn't kind to excuse them. So, I want to wrap up now. So let's just be clear about this fascinating subject. And just to conclude that you can't fix a relationship where you don't feel safe from harm. And it's best not to take any risk with being safe. And safety has to be established first as a condition to any other therapies. So, as ever, the important thing here is to stay safe first. We can't do any more further work until we do feel safe and we're in a place where we are safe from harm. And as well, it is your right to stay safe and to stay happy. Never forget that. That is all I've got for you today, so thank you for watching this video. I hope that it has been helpful and enlightening for you, and if you have any feedback, just get in touch with me. I'm always glad to hear it.